right. Okay, everybody. Good afternoon. We'd like to start. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Please take your seats, and so we can start, because we have all of our panelists to my right. Welcome back to the from the breakout sessions, everybody. And definitely the buzz that goes on here, it's obvious that your sessions have left you energized and I hope empowered to confront anti-Semitism. As Israel's Consul General to New England, it's my privilege to introduce our closing plenary, Extremism in New England. My diplomatic career has spanned some 3.5 decades, during which I have often called out the threat of extremism, and especially extremism towards the State of Israel, from people who don't really understand what the hell they're talking about. I had the opportunity to be Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, an unfortunately hypocritical organization that wants Israel to help out in all sorts of areas like agriculture, medicine, health, etc. But they continue to use us as a scapegoat for their own bad governance. It is exactly that problem that helps strengthen extremism against Israel. But not only against Israel, and Israel, like Jews around the world, is the only country, I think, and the only group that is not allowed to define itself. Somehow, all the world tells us who we are, but doesn't really allow us to say what we are and who we are. And yet, we are a minority and continue to be a minority who has suffered, like many other groups, throughout history. Living in New England over the last nearly 2 years, it is clear that extremism knows no borders. And like the book on your table, not only could it happen here, but it is happening here. Perhaps it is precisely because Boston is seen as the cradle of liberty that extremist groups have targeted our communities by parades through Boston Common in masks, horrific anti-Semitic signs on display on freeway overpasses such as Danvers-Saugus, and disruptions of healthcare initiatives designed to promote equity and gender-affirming care at Boston's world-class hospitals. How do we respond as a community? How do our responses send a message, or do they merely reward the desire for intention? Our panelists today will explore these questions. I'm very pleased to introduce Middlesex County District Attorney Marian Ryan, GBH Senior Investigative Reporter Phillip, ADL's Center on Extremism Vice President Oren Segal, and of course our moderator Peggy Shukur, the ADL's New England Deputy Director. District Attorney Marian Ryan has led the Middlesex County DA office since 2013 with a single-minded devotion of being the most dedicated, the most effective, the most transparent, and the most innovative public prosecutor's office in the United States. Just last week, DA Ryan committed to reviewing cases that involved a now former officer of the Woburn Police Department who helped plan the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and a member of an extremist group. Philip Martin's voice is well known to GBH listeners, and his award-winning investigative reporting on the growth of extremism in New England, as well as how communities are responding, has been informative and compelling. His reporting this year alone has covered the rise of white supremacist groups in New England, and he has explored how these groups weaponize First Amendment protections to intimidate marginalized communities. As Vice President of the Center on Extremism, Oren Segal and his team combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. The Center on Extremism's analysis of membership roles of the Oath Keepers, a large anti-government extremist group associated with the militia movement, attracted national attention earlier this year when it revealed members from law enforcement, government, elected officials, and others. The Center provides resources, expertise, and training to identify and counter emerging threats, including those from the Patriot Front and the neo-Nazi group NSC 131, both of who have expanded their presence in New England and have put out pamphlets all over the Northeast. And of course, we have Peggy Shukur, who serves as ADL's New England Deputy Director and deserves a longer introduction than she wrote for me, and will be moderating our panel today. So please welcome the guests and enjoy the panel. Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for joining this last session of our good fight, but really one of the first steps in all of us confronting and joining in that fight. We want to make sure, again, that this session is as interactive as the others have been. Please use the app to submit questions all throughout this session, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. As we continue on, I'm going to ask you to take a look at the screens, which in a moment will have pictures, because pictures are worth 1,000 words. And given the limitations on time today, saving 1,000 words is a good thing. But these are pictures showing activities that have happened right in Boston. We have the Patriot Front marching in Boston. On the Common in July, we have the National Social Club protesting outside the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and at our beloved St. Patrick's Day Parade. The Goyim Defense League, yet another group, has been caught holding anti-Semitic signs over freeway overpasses in Danvers and Saugus on 9/11. So as we look at these, we are very cognizant that extremism is happening in a big way in New England. And that may not be by accident. Through our conversation today, we'll explore what we're seeing, whether the activity in New England is also happening and happening in the same way elsewhere in the states, and how we can confront and disrupt this. We'll also dig deep into some recent events, including those on the screen, and including the recent revelation of the Woburn police officer who was found to have been involved in the planning of the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville 5 years ago. First, a few numbers, and then I'm going to turn it over to our experts to understand why New England is so appealing to these groups, because it's certainly not the weather. Incidents, and I don't mean to make light of this at all. Incidents of white supremacist propaganda hit an all-time high in 2020, and while it declined slightly in 2021, we're also seeing that the type of propaganda, and I'm talking about leaflets and flyers that people see plastered in their towns and on campuses, those that contain anti-Semitic messages grew by 27%. And does anyone have any idea where Massachusetts might rank in terms of being the recipient of this type of propaganda? We're in the top 5. So these are pretty sobering statistics, and we need to understand what to make of it, who these masked men are, and why they're so focused on New England. To help us understand that and set the stage, I'm going to turn it over to Oren Segal.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with this esteemed panel and to probably depress you a little bit. But we talked before, and we're going to try to end this thing with hope, especially as we get to the end of the day. So why Massachusetts? Why the sort of bastion of liberalism as it is seen by extremists? Why Los Angeles? Right? A lot of people think this is happening in the Deep South, perhaps in the Midwest. The reality is Massachusetts is in many ways not that unique. What we're seeing in terms of the images on the screen are happening around the country. But there's a recognition in Massachusetts, in the Northeast in general, that there may be an opportunity to leverage the public discussion, to leverage the polarization that we're seeing in order to try to attract new people, and frankly, to gain attention. So when Patriot Front marches through Boston, when the Jews did 9/11 is hung on a banner over a freeway, when you have LGBTQ community targeted the way that we've seen here, part of this is a photo op for extremists. They make sure that they are taking selfies of themselves. They make sure that they are streaming their activity so people around the country and around the world are able to access what they're doing in real time, often encouraging them to actually do more as they're engaging in this activity. So we know Massachusetts, there's a 42% increase in anti-Semitic incidents from 2020 to 21, more than the 34% we've seen around the country. We know that the flyering and the banners that Peggy discussed and we saw on the screen, we know that there were over 5,000 of those last year. And unfortunately, I think we're going to break a record this year. But at the end of the day, what is happening? Why do extremists feel so emboldened to so publicly try to express their hatred, to try to reach and recruit and radicalize people not only online, but try to make a spectacle of it in the real world? Is ultimately because they believe now is the time. Unlike in the past, people are more open to their ideas. The conspiracies are resonating in our politics, in our broadcast news, on the places that most of us get our information, which is on our phones or screens. Extremists never miss an opportunity to exploit a crisis. That's in Massachusetts, that's in Wisconsin, that's in Texas. And right now, they view the greatest opportunity they've had in years.
Thank you, Oren. I think I'm going to jump to our journalist here, actually, because some of what Oren said was these groups sense that this is the moment. And journalists who cover this help make it a moment. How do you balance that or deal with that in your reporting?
Well, I think Oren is spot on. When you this is a moment, for example, when you have a Texas school official saying, let's teach both sides of the Holocaust. This is a moment where for many people, night is day and day is night. The evidentiary facts are be damned. Night might be day in Helsinki, but certainly not for most people in this world. And so the whole notion of turning truth on its head, facts, evidentiary facts on its head, is something that extremists are taking advantage of. They're, as Oren pointed out, they're opportunistic. And so you're seeing the opportunism reflected in the Proud Boys, for example, attending meetings in New Hampshire of opposing quote-unquote critical race theory, that which is interpreted as critical race theory. You see the opportunism when the Patriot Front marches through Boston, unopposed by police and law enforcement, but believing that they have sympathy among some members of the public, which might be considerably more members of the public than we might presuppose. One way of ascertaining that for me has been looking at social media. And a lot of the social media at the time the Patriot Front marched through Boston this past summer said things like, well, what about Antifa? There was a both-sidism argument as opposed to a condemnation of neo-fascism, Nazis, of organizations that believe that there are two sides of the Holocaust, assumptions about history that are just fallacious, of statements about history that are fallacious. And so you're finding a largely sympathy within a large part of society that you would never have imagined would have been true even a decade ago. We are talking about let's think about a decade ago. You had a fellow named Leo Felton in 2003 who conspired to bomb the Holocaust Museum in downtown Boston. That was shocking to people. You had a situation where neo-Nazis were gathering in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Boston. And they were actually, in one instance, chased out by residents in Boston. You had a situation where the Ku Klux Klan joined with anti-busing, or tried to join with anti-busing demonstrators in Boston in the 1970s and 80s. And the anti-busing demonstrators, who had face it, they had a racial agenda, said, no, this is too much. We will not accept these type of people within our ranks. You have a situation now where there's actually sympathy for groups like the Base, groups like the Patriot Front, groups like NSC 131. A lot of people will never say, I'm a Nazi. A lot of people would never say, I accept of Nazism or fascism. But what they might accept are policy agenda that reflects the same policy goals as those whom many of these people are against. Acceptance, for example, of the so-called Great Replacement theory. The notion that immigrants are coming to this country to represent a voting bloc for Democrats and replacing white Americans. That sadly has received widespread acceptance, as was pointed out during the introduction, in large parts of our society, including here in New England.
So I would say that while there is a segment, as you've identified, of people who are accepting this, embracing it, when these incidents happen, actually our team at ADL, our phones ring off the hook. We get a lot of incident reports, and many people, and this is a question I want to direct to District Attorney Ryan. Many people say, isn't this illegal? How can you stop it? Can't you reach out to law enforcement to prosecute these people? Can you talk a bit about what the limitations are, what your role is, and what you can do, what you can't do within the law, but what communities might be able to do?
Of course, and that is a difficult question, because many times there are things that are hate-filled, that are bias-motivated, that don't rise to the level of a crime. But it is important that we know about that. One of the most disappointing things is that when something happens and we go into a community and we find out this is the last in a long stream of things that are happening that we didn't know about. We have to be clear that those kind of incidents, whether they are a crime or not, are tearing at the fabric of our communities. That's one of the reasons why a couple of years ago we began an anti-hate, anti-bias task force and put on our website a form where we ask people either telling us who they are or doing it anonymously to report those kind of incidents to us so we can know what's out there, so we can target training, and we can make that decision about whether it's something to prosecute. The real issue that so many of our law enforcement are facing is the difference, and we've heard this all morning today. There is a difference, obviously, between free speech and what's permitted and what is actionable as a crime. And we want to have those conversations about that. Peggy joined us just a few weeks ago at a panel that we did for our law enforcement partners, talking about how do you understand the difference? When someone comes in and reports something, how do you parse through what they're telling you to find out if there's something to be charged? Because one of the things that's really critical is that we name what's happening. You can't deal with something that you won't name, that you won't have conversation around. And we want to be able to do that. And those incidents are growing at an incredible rate. And it really gets to the lack of respect for the rule of law. It gets to the attack on the democratic process. And it really is incumbent on all of us to be aware of that, to be making those things known, and to have the conversations that can lead us to, when appropriate, charging those crimes as what they are, hate crimes. One of the things we've spent a lot of time working on in the last couple of years is really making our hate crime statutes better, because there are some significant gaps in those statutes that don't allow us to charge things that should be crimes. We want to fix that. And then thinking about what do we do in the remedial process in the community.
I just want to add, there's a question here of how realistic is it that our local law enforcement can stay on top of these unprecedented threats? We know that so much of this is incubated online. To your point, so much of it is free speech. In America, you're allowed to be as hateful as you want to be, right? That's the reality. But we also know that these words and these narratives and this disinformation so clearly animates violent activity on the ground. I mean, I love our relationship with law enforcement, with DA's office, et cetera. I would never work for them because I can see so much more as a part of an organization where I don't need to get a court order in order to open up an investigation. Right? We need to be in so many spaces at so many different times and then share that with our partners so they can, take our actionable information and try to protect communities. But I will tell you, part of this is because law enforcement doesn't have the skills necessarily, right? It's not part of, a local law enforcement officer to be like the early adopter to 1.5 million platforms as they develop. It's just not realistic. I always make the joke. I learn about new technology and new platforms from the extremists that we're monitoring every single day and from my, 11-year-old son, right? They're the ones who are going to tell me what's new. And here's the reality. We are seeing more of these threats. And those who are responsible for some of the attacks, and I'll end here, I will tell you what they're doing online is actually no longer remarkable. There are thousands and thousands of these people who are encouraging violence, using great replacement theory, trying to organize campaigns online that we see activate on the ground. And so we're not going to arrest our way out of this. We have to come with creative solutions to take it back into the places where this is incubating.
So I want to turn to Phillip for a moment before we dig a little deeper into the Woburn police officer we talked about earlier. I had one of those NPR driveway moments hearing a story you did on Franklin, New Hampshire, and that community's response to NSC 131 protesting there. And you and I spoke, I think, last year about a similar community response in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of how communities are confronting these groups and whether you feel it's effective? What is your reporting showing?
Absolutely. In addition to the notion, we've been confronted by headline after headline from Boston to Austin, Texas, to Los Angeles, neo-Nazis holding banners over freeways, neo-Nazis threatening people, groups that don't want to be seen as neo-Nazis but are nevertheless neo-fascists, like the Patriot Front. And it's headline after headline after headline. Fewer headlines we're seeing are about people who are pushing back against this danger, against the propagation of hate, and so on and so forth. And what I saw in Franklin, New Hampshire, after a call from a young woman in New Hampshire who said, look, Phillip, I really appreciate your reporting. I'm wondering why we aren't seeing more about people who are on the streets, who are in their businesses, in schools, so on and so forth, who are pushing back. And what I decided to do was focus on one community, Franklin, where I've met a young woman named Marian who is of Asian and Jewish descent. And she had one day said, enough. She helped organize a demonstration against NSC 131 in Portsmouth, in Kittery, Maine, and in other places. And she had joined with other people in other small towns, Dover, New Hampshire, Concord, Salem, Massachusetts, other places around the region against the pushback against the type of ideology that we're experiencing, the concomitant concomitant violence of that ideology. And I drove up to Franklin and found a community that decided to convene a meeting where the entire town voiced opposition to the type of bigotry, anti-Semitism, hate that we're seeing around the country, because it was important for them to say, we are taking a stand. Theirs is part of the good fight. And Miriam Kovac's grandfather was among those, and relatives were among those who died in the Holocaust, and she had other relatives who perished in the Holocaust. That was instructive to her, but not just that. What she had seen across the American South was instructive. The notion of what we saw during Reconstruction and the pushback against Reconstruction was instructive to her. She talked about all of these lessons and why she runs a catering company and a bakery. And in the minute she spoke out, she started receiving one-star reviews. One reviewer identified himself as Rudolf Hess. Another identified himself as Goring. And these are the type of reviews she was receiving. But she also received extraordinary support from people in her community who are non-Jewish, and many of them, and across the region. And we're seeing this duplicated in communities, again, across the region.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Actually, that raises a question that I think I'd like to raise for both DA Ryan and for Oren. And that is, do people know what to look for? Like just ordinary people, like NSC 131, do people have any idea what their logo looks like, who they are, or are people sort of surprised just when someone walks through, but they don't really know how to pin them down and how to identify them really as a purveyor of hate in our communities?
I think that we need more education around that. I think there are lots of people who don't know that. There are certainly the people that are aware of these issues who are following things probably on social media and know that. But I know when we had some of these groups appear in our communities during the summer, people knew it was a bad thing. They knew it was something they probably wanted to stay away from. It was shocking to me how little people in the community really knew about what those beliefs were.
So I was just say that there's two tactics that are going on. One is, creating fear and anxiety in communities by being blatant about the hatred on your banner, on your flyer, on your clothes, right? And some extremist groups are still quite blatant. So you don't have to be too, steeped into this work to recognize the hatred, especially when you see their targets. I also think that there's a secondary tactic that they use, which is by design to do the same activity without the blatant hate symbols, et cetera. Patriot Front, as you mentioned, sort of depends where they are in the country, but fits the bill. Because what they want to do is sort of tempt you to be interested in what they're doing, and then once you scratch the surface, you see the anti-Semitism, racism, and bigotry there. They also are trying to leverage public discussion, whether it's election denial, right? Whether it's a whole host of other disinformation out there that we know is animating people, they are, glomming onto the latest sort of public discussion in order to seem as if they're like legitimate political players. I mean, NSC 131, the 131 stands for Anti-Communist Action. That is a position that they're taking, that they are anti-left, anti-Antifa, right? Like very blatantly trying to put politics, to the degree that we have politics today in any reasonable way, onto their agenda. And the last thing I want to say about this, I know we talk about flyers and banners, and I've heard people say, what's the big deal? I mean, so is somebody going to get killed by like 1,000 paper cuts from a flyer? When you have anti-Semitic language or racist language thrown into your lawn in the front of your house, you start being suspicious of the people in your community. Who hates me, right? This is at the core of eroding our sense of safety. It's at the core of eroding our democracy. So a flyer on a lawn is one thing. Then the conspiracies online add to that erosion. then the public discussion from some elected officials or from broadcast news reinforces that again. It's at our own peril that we ignore the so-called small stuff in this country.
So let me just take, I just actually.
Can I say just one?
Yeah, of course.
Another example that I think is a really important example took place on St. Patrick's Day. You saw the photograph earlier where NSC 131, 20 or so members are at the St. Patrick's Day parade unfurling a banner that said, "Keep Boston Irish." Well, what was particularly problematic about that is they were there for about 2 hours before someone basically came, a man and his wife came with a banner saying these are Nazis and tried to exhort the crowd to turn on the Nazis, who immediately left after that. But I found it interesting that for 2 hours people were passing by assuming, and so I think there was a bit of a confusion, and I hope there wasn't a great degree of acceptance. But there was at the very least, confusion. Why anyone would be confused by a banner that says "Keep Boston Irish," I'm not sure. That's fairly clear. But you did have a situation where they were out there for 2 hours before anyone said anything, and I found that to be questionable.
Now that's really an important piece to raise. Yeah. In the time we have left, I want to circle back to law enforcement, and in particular, this Woburn police officer. And the point I want to ask is, it was 5 years after the Unite the Right rally that all this news came out. I'd like to ask each of you, why did that take so long? And what are the ripple effects in our community?
I think this incident, and unfortunately what we know that the federal government has known about since at least 2006, which is that many of these extremist organizations are intentionally infiltrating law enforcement. You know, the vast majority of law enforcement are honest, hardworking people doing their job. But when you think about the harm that can be done by even a small number of people in these positions, both the harm in terms of why are they doing that? They're doing that to get access to things. They're doing it to get access to databases. They're doing it to take advantage of the training of law enforcement. You know, one of the allegations about this officer is that he was providing information to the organizers of Charlottesville on how to avoid perimeters from law enforcement, where to be, how to disguise yourself. So that's what they're looking for. The amount of harm that can be done in actual fact is enormous, and even greater is the harm it can do to the community. And the question of how do people operate in a way that those working with them don't know, that's obviously something we need to be looking at, but it also goes to the fact of how you can intentionally live sort of a double life, and how it is possible to live online using pseudonyms or joining groups or doing other sorts of things. And that's something we all have to be thinking about. We were talking earlier. I think about it in terms of people we bring into our office, people we bring into other government offices. What kind of information can we gather? Are we satisfied that we're looking at all of these pieces? Because the harm is enormous. And what it does to the fabric of trust can be really incredibly challenging in terms of how we address that.
I just want to mention two quick things. One is, this is where we try to be helpful, right? So we have a hate symbols database that we make available not only to the public, but also, a more in-depth version to policymakers, law enforcement, military, et cetera, because we know, because we hear them speak every single day, we're tracking them online, they are trying to intentionally infiltrate our democratic institutions. I'm talking about extremists, whether it's military, law enforcement, politics, et cetera. And so, I think it's extra important that people in those really critical positions have whatever they can to try to identify it. Because somebody might walk in for an interview and have a tattoo. Or somebody, to a degree, may make a mistake and put something on social media. It's really important. This is a tool to help. But the second thing is just underscoring that this is the tactic. Because the extremists no longer feel like they have to stay on the fringes. They believe that they have enough support whether it's the people walking by and seeing Boston should stay Irish, et cetera, and not commenting, they believe that they have an opportunity to undermine our democratic institutions, which they need in order to succeed, by being part of it. That's different. It wasn't always like that. We didn't have extremists running for office. We didn't have extremists intentionally trying to, enter various, professions that have, really sensitive data, by the way, and then undermine the concern, basically foment the concerns that communities have. Because when you have just one law enforcement officer, and it is the minority of them, who might support white supremacists, or as an anti-Semite, or as a member of the Oath Keepers, I mean, that's hard trust to gain back. And so it's really critical that we do what we can in recognizing what they want to do, be clear-eyed about that, and then work with partner organizations to make sure we're limiting the ability of extremists to become part of our democracy in that way, because they will destroy it.
Well, it also goes to calling it out and being clear-eyed about it. I mean, we have election deniers on our ballot next week, and we know that. We have people in these positions that are saying things. They're not hiding who they are. And there is a very big difference between being tolerant, between free speech, between people being able to have different views, and really recognizing the harm that it can do to our institutions. We say all the time as when you're in a court system, that court system depends every single day on juries or judges making decisions that are unpopular to one side or the other. Mm-hmm. And people accepting that and leaving the courtroom and going back into the community. We have relied on that for decades. We had an incident just in the last few months where we had a judge make a decision, and then we had a murder in the parking lot. And it's easy to say that was one incident, but it is of a piece of this fabric that's just being eroded by so many of the things that are going on right now. And it's really important that we call that out and think about how are we going to address it.
I think it's also important to look at, when I'm thinking about the role of police officers and law enforcement officials, and this whole notion of, for lack of a word, infiltration by these forces, one thing you might point to is the recent Marshall Project study, which is a survey of sheriffs around the country, in which 500 of 3,000 sheriffs responded to a survey asking about their ideological sentiments and their adherence to law in a broad sense. And you found quite a few of sheriffs, about 200 among this 500 that replied to the survey, are election deniers, are strong supporters of a concept that we rarely use the term now, but posse comitatus, which is the whole notion of the formation of posse and the adherence to law within a county, as opposed to adhering to federal law, so on and so forth, and believe that they can basically, they have the authority, the supreme authority. And a lot of these individuals also revealed in this survey extreme views on race, of conspiracy theories that are without question blatantly anti-Semitic, whether they describe it as such or not. When you start talking about George Soros and so on and so forth, and this argument we're hearing about an international conspiracy, I mean, this is Dreyfus type stuff. This is protocols, elders of Zion. And they're not always referencing these things, because it's, for a lot of people, that is history people don't know. But they reference things that they assume will basically appeal to a larger group. And conspiracy theories do appeal to a lot of group. Kanye West is a face of anti-Semitism. It requires pigmentation does not determine your beliefs in someone's inferiority or someone as a boogeyman. But I'm pointing him out because it's important to note that we're talking about ideology that's widespread. It's ideology, white supremacists can be black, white supremacists can be Kanye West, they can be Candace Owens. And you have this type of phenomenon that's happening around the country where people are embracing these theories because they are being propagated in a larger sphere. At one point, posse comitatus was considered extreme and just out there. Now you have sheriffs who embrace many of their ideas. Some of them, not all, among the 200 I'm referencing, are members of Oath Keepers. You have Oath Keepers in Massachusetts, as the ADL has pointed out in its reporting, including, as Marian just pointed out, 2 who are running for elected office, including down in Cape Cod. So we're talking about something that is ostensibly complex, but at the same time opportunistic and widespread, and it requires a good fight in order to basically repel the type of problems that we're seeing in this country that represent this moment.
Thank you. Now, when we were preparing for this, we agreed we were going to end on a positive or inspiring note.
Let's do it.
It's a little bit of a challenge, but I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give 1 or 2 suggestions of how to do that, and to give them 30 seconds to think about it. I'm going to tell you about some of the tools you actually have right in those bags you got. There is a toolkit there. In that toolkit, it tells you how you can speak up. It tells you where you can find key ADL resources, including that database Oren was talking about. So you can become the expert, you can become the eyes and ears in helping us, so you can identify those symbols that you might see in a community and report them. It tells you how to report incidents. It tells you how to report incidents both to ADL and to the U.S. Attorney's Office through an 800 line, as well as to local district attorneys like Marian Ryan's office, depending on where you live. So you have a lot of tools at your fingertips, and we really urge you to join the good fight and act with those tools. So now you've had a little time to think. I'll start with you, Oren.
Great. So, all bad stuff, but I feel, and I know we've talked about this, I feel very blessed. Who do I get to work with every single day? Whether it's the district attorney's office, journalists, my colleagues, others who are basically dedicating a portion of their lives to do something about what we're talking about. I would feel hopeless if I had to go home every day, see all that's happening, and not feel like I had an opportunity to push back on that. So my hope is seeing the commitment that I see throughout ADL, throughout other organizations and partners who are saying, all right, this is not going to stand, right? So I really, at the end of the day, believe, even though I haven't slept in about 17 years, that this moment in time will be remembered, not for the violence and the hatred and the banners and the communities that have been shattered by violence, but about what good people, including you in this room, did in response to that. And I see that every day, and I'm lucky. So that's hope for me.
I'm emboldened by a changing journalistic landscape where journalists are more and more apt to call a lie a lie. The notion of obfuscation of truth is not all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, I wouldn't say all of a sudden, but gradually more and more journalists accept that you cannot talk about both sidisms, for example, in the context of the Holocaust or slavery. These things are not tantamount, that there's no both sidism, so I'm encouraged by that. I'm also encouraged by something that's clear to me. I was talking to a young journalist out here who's at Harvard, that it's important to stay in the room. That when you're having these difficult discussions and reporting situations in the country, don't leave the room. Stay in the room, engage those communities. And I'm seeing, I'm very willing to engage communities who I'm not talking about NSC 131. I'm talking about individuals who might accept the great replacement theory, for example. Because I'm willing, and the reason I'm willing to stay in the room and engage that community is because I have evidentiary facts on my side, which Freud called it truth, right, correct? Plato called it truth, correct? The sky is a sky, a rock is a rock. And as long as I have facts, truth, and I can basically engage communities with that, I'm willing to engage them. Now, there are a lot of communities that will basically say, I still believe the sky is not the sky and the day is night. But it's important to engage, and I think we are seeing that with journalism, and I believe that we are, that more and more people are willing, I'm finding more and more people willing to call out the lie.
Thank you, and thank you for actually leading that in the profession.
Thank you. Yeah.
District Attorney Ryan.
So I think there's really three things that give me hope. One is, and we saw an example of some of that today, it is young people who really see the need to be having these conversations. We run a social justice roundtable program in the high schools across our county. And you see people who are staying in the room, who are having those conversations, educating themselves. As we saw this morning, the college students who appreciate those conversations. I think it is communities that are willing to do this work. We've begun offering a critical thinking program that we're offering to teenagers in communities, seeing communities coming forward, saying that they want to be engaged in those conversations, they want to bring their young people into that. And finally, back to what Oren said, it is having amazing partners. The ADL has been an amazing partner to us this year in so many of the issues. You know, both Robert and Peggy and Oren have all been, sometimes on very short notice, have helped us go into communities to talk about what's happening, to begin that really remedial work that has to happen. And that's a gift. And that is something that I think we are incredibly fortunate to have. So all of those things give me hope.
Thank you. Good. All right, I just want to thank everybody and thank our panelists for sharing their expertise with all of you as we go forward in the good fight. Thanks.
Thank you.
We're going to stay for about a minute.
Okay, a couple of quick, you guys can stay or go. I know people want to leave, so I have a couple of just 2 minutes of a couple closing words. 2 minutes, and then everybody can get on with their Sunday. First of all, there are books that are out there on the tables, and you are free to take a book or two home for yourself or people in your friend or family group. I do want to thank everybody for coming out today, for joining today's Good Fight Forum on combating anti-Semitism. A couple of important thank yous to our incredible plenary speakers who you heard from today, President Johnson, and just now District Attorney Marian Ryan, Phillip Martin, Oren Segal, and Peggy Shukur. I want to thank all of the breakout speakers, and in particular the students who demonstrated a lot of courage today in sharing their campus experiences. This is an important thank you, is to the ADL Boston team. And this team has been led for months by Darren Pressman-Mashin, who led all of your experiences today. So I do just really want to thank them. I want to thank our lead sponsors, the Meyer-Daner Trust, the Ruderman Family Foundation, CJP, Combined Jewish Philanthropies, and the Abraham Shapiro Family Trust. And now just indulge me for 2 more minutes. The challenges of 2022, and I would venture to say also the challenges that we are going to see in 2023 are unique. And that's because the forces that traffic in anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and perpetuate conspiracy theories are constantly adapting their tactics, their strategies, and their targets. And you just heard some insight into that in the last couple of minutes. And sometimes it's a flyer in a neighborhood. It could be extremists marching through the streets of Boston. It could be banner drops over the highway. It could be inspiring people online to commit acts of violence. And it could be celebrities who endorse or embrace anti-Semitism or racism. It could be isolating Jewish students on a campus, or it could be as simple as a lesson plan or assignment in a K through 12 public school or even an independent school. But all of this is actually happening. And it is all happening in real time, and it is all happening in New England, where we live and where our families live. And so today was really about being engaged in a lot of thinking, in a lot of learning, in a lot of discussing and planning. But between now and the next time that we reconvene this good fight, which will probably be in 10 to 12 months from now, the main thing is that we actually need to act. We need to do something. And people of goodwill outnumber those who seek to do us harm. That's a really important point. And people with a strong moral compass, they outnumber the people who embrace hate. And people who oppose anti-Semitism vastly outnumber those who blame the Jews for the world's problems. ADL in the past 2 weeks led a global initiative to get Adidas to take an act against anti-Semitism, and they did it. But the act that they took was only initiated because tens of thousands of people sent messages to Adidas that they needed to take a stand against anti-Semitism. Today we heard from some college students who took an act by writing an op-ed, organizing, and speaking out against anti-Semitism on campus. We also just heard about communities that took actions to unite against hateful extremists and neo-Nazis in their towns. So people of goodwill, people who have a moral compass, people who oppose anti-Semitism, they recognized what was happening around them, and they actually did something. They acted. And their collective actions actually led to change. So each of you took an act today, because you actually showed up. And I don't underestimate the importance of showing up. It actually is an act. It means something. There is significance to it. You can do one more thing today, either now or on your way out, and that's you can go to MassachusettsAgainstAntisemitism.org, where there is a pledge against anti-Semitism. And we are building a movement against anti-Semitism. You heard a few of the speakers earlier this morning mention it. Catherine Clark, Congresswoman Clark mentioned it. And you'll see that there are a number of inaugural signers of the pledge. Treasurer Deb Goldberg from the Commonwealth, our treasurer, was one of the inaugural signers. She was here earlier today. Oh, she's still here. Okay. Thank you for pointing that out, Treasurer. Look, you need to act. And you need to encourage others to do so. The toolkit that's in your bags that Peggy just referenced, you all received it. It's full of action. And so the challenges in closing are real. The threat is real. Anti-Semitism is real. But we can do something about it. You can do something about it by joining us, by joining the movement to combat anti-Semitism. Thank you for being here today. And I look forward to taking action alongside each of you. Enjoy the rest of your day.